Well, hello again, and welcome back to your favourite classic dirt bike TV channel. Now, I'm just back from my week's annual vacation or holiday, and we just spent a week in the Scottish Highlands in Kincraig with the rest of the family. So that was a nice week away and a little break from classic dirt bike TV. But of course now it's time to get back to work and post more videos for my YouTube subscribers. Now, coming up next, we're going to take a look at a bike that I came across at the recent Westmoreland Golden Jubilee race weekend that was held back in July. Now, this is a very nice bike and a very rare machine from the early 1980s. So without any further delay, let's just take a look at Kevin Thornton's lovely 1980 KTM 125. Now, these smaller KTM Twinshockers, as I said, are not very often seen at vintage race events these days, and this example of Kevin Thornton's is an almost original bike from that early 1980s period. Now, Kevin told me that he bought this bike from an owner in Germany some years ago, and he hasn't really done anything with the bike with regards replacing any parts, but basically all he really did was prep the bike to get it ready for racing. But as I remember, these were very good little race bikes for their time, and they had decent suspension on the front and rear. Quite a good steel chassis made, of course, from light gauge steel tubing, and of course a buzzy little piston port two-stroke motor, which of course when worked hard could certainly give a much bigger engine bike a run for its money. Now, as you're already aware, the bigger 250s and 400s and even the legendary 495 KTMs are certainly a bit more common to see around the vintage race paddocks, but these smaller 125s are pretty rare items when it comes to actual racing on a track. Now, I'm not entirely sure if this is a 1980 or 1981 example, but nonetheless a lovely looking machine. Now, if my memory serves me correctly, these single cylinder piston port two-stroke KTM engines had a bore and stroke of 54 millimeters, and you can see that it also had quite a big surface area for the motor's barrel and head, which was more than likely just to help dissipate the heat generated by that 125 power plant. Now, also these little KTM 125s had a wet multi-plate clutch, which was connected to the crankshaft by way of a gear, and not the older primary chain configuration on some machines. Now, these 125s also had a 6-speed gearbox, which was again more than likely just to help with the motor's lack of CCs, because having more gears, of course, at your disposal would increase the flexibility of the engine while on different racetracks. But back in the day, I'm sure these 125s were also fitted with a Bing carburetor as a standard fitting, but it looks like Kevin's particular motor here has been fitted with a Japanese-made Mikuni carb as a substitute. Although for me personally, I've always thought that the older Bings were very good carburetors for these older types of two-strokers. You just have to set them up correctly and experiment with different jets and settings until you find that sweet spot. Now, once more, the ignition sparks on these 125 KTMs were much the same as their larger brothers, and were normally supplied by way of the electronic Motoplat system of rotor and stator. Now, the bike's front suspension was normally a pair of Italian-made 35mm Marzoccis, which for an early bike from the 1980s was still decent enough, although scope for adjustment was somewhat limited, but it still gave this little 125 quite long legs, and suspension travel at the front was around 10.5 inches. And again, the bike's front and rear brakes were decent enough for a 1980s Twinshocker. Now once again, I'm almost sure that these little KTM 125s had Italian-made Marzoccis fitted on the rear of these Twinshockers, and these shocks certainly look like they're the correct suspension units for the bike, although I never actually got any details of the parts fitted to the bike on the day that I shot these clips. So they may not be Marzoccis, but they certainly look like them when you see them here. Now once more, a quite substantial looking alloy swing arm for such a smaller 125, and I'm sure that this part was actually shared with a few of the other twin-shock KTMs of that period, and as far as I can remember, these were pretty sturdy items, and they had just about enough flex to give decent feedback to the bike's rider when they were raced over a bumpy racetrack, but certainly it looks tough enough to cope with anything this little 125 would ever come across. Now naturally a plastic fuel tank for the 1980s, because by this time most dirt bike manufacturers were beginning to switch from the slightly heavier and more expensive alloy or steel tanks to these cheaper moulded plastic fuel cells. But this tank would normally have held more than enough gas to keep that little 125 KTM motor buzzing along. Now, as I remember from back in the day, these KTM seats were among one of the plushest seats of all the early 1980 125 bikes that were around at that time, although riders more than likely never got a chance to enjoy it while they were so busy dancing up and down on that 6-speed gearbox. Although I'd have to say that in the many years I've been involved in vintage dirt bikes and motocross in general, this for me is the very first of these KTM 125 Twinshockers that I've ever came across in the flesh, so to speak. And as I said, you just don't see these bikes these days. Now, whether that's because not many of them were made, or because there are not many clubs who have actual classes for these smaller Twinshockers, I don't know, but these are certainly a rare bike, and it's great that the likes of Kevin are still using them at classic race meetings, which of course also gives us all a chance to take a look at them once again. Because as you know, these smaller 125s of course don't carry the prestige or status that its bigger brother enjoyed when KTM launched their outrageously powerful 495 in 1981, which I'm sure still holds the world record for the fastest motocrosser of all time, when at a test track the rider clocked 123.75 miles per hour on a flat test track, and to this day that record still stands. So maybe it's about time that somebody dusted down the mighty 490 Micro Mega 2 and try and steal KTM's thunder. Well, I hope you enjoyed that quite brief look around Kevin Thornton's quite nice looking 1980 KTM 125 Twinshocker. Now, it's a bike that you very seldom see at vintage race events these days, and that particular bike of Kevin's is a lovely example of one of these little 125 screamers. Now, as I said in previous videos, August is quite a busy month for me this month, and in a couple of days' time we'll be heading down to the border town of Lockerbie to cover the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Club's event at Cumston Fareham. Now, just a few days after that, we will be packing up our camera equipment again, but this time we'll be heading over to Northern Ireland to cover the Northern Ireland Classic Scramble Club's two-day charity event that's held at Ballysala Road at the Cecil Pearson's racetrack. So don't forget, you can see all the bikes and all the racing from both of these events here on my YouTube channel soon after. So if you still like what you see here on my channel, then please consider subscribing. But until the next time, keep those old vintage racers on the track, and we'll all get together soon to talk about more vintage iron right here on your #1 Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.